Hey, good afternoon. So this is a joint project, and with these four affiliate researchers at the Center for Computational Law. And essentially, the large idea here is that we want to study the correlation between legal change and linguistic change, right? So of course, using a computational manner. So before I begin, I should clarify that this really is more of a research plan than a research paper, which is why you won't find a paper in the repository. Although I suspect that the conference organizers are quite okay with this. Um, so for a broad overview, my opening act here would be just to introduce the legal background and to try to convince you that Singapore law is a useful context to do computational legal studies in. And I'll get to why quickly in shortly. Megan will then do some a short bridging into the more technical aspects before Avalon and Adam and Dimitri give us perspectives from their respective fields: computer science, math, linguistics. Right. So the broad question again: how does law and judicial languages correlate? Now, so the reason we are interested to study Singapore law is not just because we're Singaporean and all our money and funding comes from here, but that it is actually a useful context to learn something that I think generalizable or perhaps even universal about the law, especially about law and linguistic change. There is a Chinese proverb, if I might start, that goes like this: the sparrow might be small, but it has all five, and in fact, all of its internal organs. So by that I mean that although Singapore is a relatively small jurisdiction, you could fit all our case law on a thumb drive, and I have all of our case law on a thumb drive. I actually have that. It's all there. It's a fully functioning, relatively young, but also in some ways old legal system. It's all that you need, and despite the small population, it has something that, if I might say, an influence that I think it's disproportionate to its size and also growing. Right. So as a young legal system, right, there's some interest, there's some reason why we want to study this, and locally speaking, right, Singapore takes its legal development very seriously. By that, I mean that having been only around as a nation state for about 50 to 60 years, we want to know whether our laws have been growing up okay. And we've taken periodic empirical snapshots of this. I'm showing some of the work that we have done to kind of understand empirically how in this example, it is the word count in judgments and how they have doubled over the last few years, the last decade or so. If you go down the years in terms of the intensity of the heat that you see on the map. And there's other work that we've done to look at things like citations and how that has gone. It's begun from something that's very foreign. We used to import almost all of our laws, but now we make our own. That's reflected in this diagram that goes through the years from the 1800s to about 2017. And that's all just to say that we are taking this pretty seriously, and we want to know, that's it, whether we've been growing up all right. So when Megan mentioned that her team had been working on ways to measure and study linguistic change, and they have a paper in the computational law report about this, I was very excited to explore how we could kind of work together and see how that might be applied to the very relevant context that I believe is Singapore law. And that question turns out to be a bit more difficult than we thought, because Singapore is rather different from the US or the EU, where most of the CLS work has been done, in the sense that, to give you a simple example, if you look at just the historical variation in Singapore's courts, as a matter of how the Singapore system might be a bit unique from these other systems that are more well studied, here's a timeline of our apex courts over the years. Right, so these are just the top courts that we used to refer to over about 200 years of court history, not even including the lower courts now. And of course, by comparison, here is your US Supreme Court, which has stayed the same, at least in name, from the 1700s. Right. So of course, there's all that state level variation in the US, which people love to exploit empirically, which Singapore does not have. So we wanted to delve into this interplay between legal and linguistic change in case law in particular, and sort of latched onto this doctrine of Laches. And as defined here, it's basically an equitable doctrine, which we know it bars relief where there is substantial lapse of time, and there are circumstances which make it the claim inequitable to enforce. Right, so this is per recent case that the Court of Appeal, our current apex court, handed down. And as an equitable doctrine, it comes with all of equities, affordances, clean hands, all this other stuff that people would know about. So Laches was interesting for us as a doctrine because it began as one of those things that, as usual, we import from the British. Actually, it comes from Canadian case law, which Megan is very familiar with. And it has been over the years interpreted by the Singapore courts in a number of different ways, including a very recent landmark judgment, which doctrinal scholars here might be interested in, where actually the court decided that Laches does not apply to unjust enrichment claims. And there's some reasoning given on that. So it's very relevant, it's historical. There's some scope to think about how it has changed over the years. And on that note, I would pass the time to Megan, who's joining us from. Okay, Megan, you're at Stanford right now. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and a pleasure to be here. Thank you again, Gerald, for the fantastic introduction and setting the stage. So my role today is to act as a helpful transistor as we switch gears into how the Singaporean legal system is uniquely positioned to study notions of legal evolution, in particular, its interactions with methods of historical linguistics and computation. So to start, niche construction theory suggests that actors themselves may be the drivers of evolution, that specific groups will be both the object of natural selection and the creator of the conditions for that selection. Provided this definition, I will open with a brief note on how I see this theory has overlaps in questions pertaining to legal evolution. To contextualize, niche construction theory that I speak of applies to two specific categories. The first being counteractive perturbation, and the second, counteractive relocation. In the former, organisms are said to counteract a prior change in the environment by physically modifying their surroundings. In the latter, organisms are said to respond to changes in the environment by moving to or growing to a more suitable place. Immediately, we may be able to identify how this theory could capture some of the experiences induced by Singapore's own legal actors. This move from foreign to local jurisprudence, their behavior becoming drivers of change. The significance of issuing this practice statement and direction in 1994 and 2008 respectively may be regarded as an evident response to an environmental or legislative change. Practice statements and directions are intended for lawyers only, and lawyers are therefore physically modifying their own surroundings. They're asked to reshape the circumstances and context in which legal meaning takes form. The legal language is unlike other technical languages, precisely owed to the centrality of natural language in the performance of legal work. More importantly, natural language is a double-edged sword in both its expressibility and flexibility. We refer here to the imprecision behind word meaning. This characteristic is perhaps nowhere better exemplified than through case law. A prime example is the interpretation of the verb to use a firearm in Smith versus United States. In our prior research, we asked a simple question: what is the significance of meaning in legal language? This question was tested through the translation of legal text to algorithmic form. We hypothesized that meaning draws association from the language in which it is seated, that in changing the language, meaning will naturally be reconceptualized. We used a selected set of judicial cases from the United States Supreme Court and deconstructed sentences of legal judgments to their constituent components. The combined relative precision of syntactic structures and broad statistical modeling of context demonstrated that hybrid techniques provide a deeper understanding of legal text, both in conceptual framing and semantic interpretation. Our research illustrates that words of legal text intrinsically embody meaning. In fact, the legal language is markedly self-referential and consistent. The semantic content of legal text is derived from a legal taxonomy that, in effect, reinforces specific legal framing. Therefore, we found that with the malleability of natural language, the exercise of defining and categorizing in legal context can itself be considered a form of niche construction. Modifications of meaning put forth by its own actors as driving evolution in the legal environment. It is how we may construct a horse as a vehicle. I refer here to the case of a man heavily inebriated who commandeered a horse, went for a joyride, and was subsequently charged for driving under the influence. It is how the words spouse, family, domicile, gender all evolved in time. Legal comparativist Geoffrey Samuel famously noted that the common law pushes outward from the facts. Perhaps it is better reframed as the common law pushes outward from its language. And so a close computational linguistic study of how this phenomenon occurred as manifested in changes in Singapore's case law and legislative corpora over time can yield fascinating observations on meaning making. Can linguistic shifts then trace the evolution of legal concepts? Here's where my fellow colleagues will expand further. The extension of the object-oriented approach outlined in our prior work can enable a precise usage-based and empirically defensible analysis of the diachronic changes in terminology and legal reasoning. I now turn to Adam Nicholas, our resident linguist in the team, to describe further the use of historical linguistics as a method to deconstruct and identify the fingerprints of legal evolution.
Thank you, Megan, and greetings everyone from a rather early morning in Cambridge, England. Historical linguistics is the study of how languages change over time. Language change is, at least on the surface level, often intuitively felt. Consider how the youth of today speak in comparison with the elder generations. We all notice certain changes, particularly in accent and dated vocabulary or new slang. However, there are more elements of language on deeper linguistic levels to consider. Alongside pronunciation and vocabulary, there is unending development and innovation in the subconscious grammatical system and in word meaning. Oftentimes, though, truly significant change occurs over considerably longer periods, over many generations of linguistic transmission. For instance, the decline of the Old English grammatical system, which led to the Middle English period, spanned some several centuries. However, in this instance, we do not have several centuries of data. Thus, the question is, how might Singaporean legal language have measurably changed over the past few decades since independence? Furthermore, how might examining language through a computational lens be able to help with this? This got us thinking. As a certain legal term or concept becomes more popular or even emblematic within a certain jurisdiction and begins to form its own locally derived nuances and applications, then surely this would be reflected in the legal language. With this in mind, we chose to conduct a pilot test on the term Laches, the legal equity defense. It has come to our attention that Laches, perhaps for those in other jurisdictions an unfamiliar term, has gained traction as a legal device in the last decades following Singapore's independence. This traction should roughly coincide with the introductions of the Application of English Law Act 1994 and the Practice Direction of 2008, all of which rode a tide of change regarding independence and an actively encouraged uniqueness of Singaporean legal identity, as discussed by Gerald earlier. Turning back to historical linguistics for inspiration, the comparative method is a technique whereby two historically related languages are examined in tandem to explore their divergences and innovations. Drawing inspiration from this, we could view early Singaporean law and more recent Singaporean law with its stronger, more established Singaporean identity as examples of two divergent but related languages. Considering that sound change is of less relevance here since the law is for the most part written down in prose, we consider a comparative approach then to the semantics, word meaning, and syntax, sentence structure. Next slide, please. Thank you. Beginning with the former, word meaning, our computational system, to be discussed in more detail by my colleagues soon, allows us to model semantic similarity and plot relations between single words. This is a fresh approach for the traditional linguist, since the pursuit of word meaning is mostly more philosophical, objective, and crucially, nigh unquantifiable. However, a computational machine learning angle provides a means to produce a quantifiable metric of word meaning based on word embeddings. We hypothesize that a marked mismatch in semantic similarity will be noted when comparing earlier with more recent Singaporean Laches cases, whereas semantic similarity will be deemed much higher when comparing contemporary or synchronic cases. Beginning with the key term Laches and plotting its potentially quantifiable semantic drift over the last decades, we could then delve yet deeper into the comparative lexicon, comparing the semantic relations of correlated terms such as time bar, contract, equity, nature of the claim, statutory limitation, and so forth. This in itself would be a remarkable demonstration, given that modern computational approaches allow for a level of quantifiability out of the reach of everyday linguists. That being said, the analysis does not end there. Our approach, to be discussed, allows for addressing the linguistic structure surrounding and encompassing certain concepts and keywords. Inspired by historical analyses of syntax, sentence structure, we hypothesize that as Laches begins to take on an independent Singaporean application and flavor, the deviation from other common law applications will require more complex language. We acknowledge that linguistic complexity can be controversial since complexity is by and large objective. Nonetheless, and to the contrary, by viewing complexity through a computational lens, we now have the means to scrutinize and compare sentence structure in a manner out of reach of the traditional linguist. Running with the dependency parsing approach to syntax common in the computational world, certain metrics towards a quantification of syntactic complexity can be envisaged. Combining our team's expertise with graph databases and algorithms, we plan to explore and compare the deep-rooted underlying linguistic hierarchies surrounding the concept Laches and its conceptual legal application and development in Singapore over the last few decades. Such features as recursion, for example, nested clause phenomena, the relative hierarchical structuring of key abstractions, and syntactic tree similarity could all be analyzed as metrics quantifying the linguistic complexity associated with conceptual development and innovation in the independent Singaporean law. Whereas historical linguists depend on manually and painstakingly cherry-picked examples, the computational angle opens a world of big data analysis and a way to plot and identify even the subtlest of trends and changes over potentially very short timescales with minimal effort. Once again, we are unaware of any multidisciplinary approach along these lines. I now pass the torch to my colleagues who are working on developing the computational side of the system. Over to Dimitri, our data scientist.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Adam. And also hello from a morning Cambridge. So, as Adam has just mentioned, we are looking specifically at two phenomena or manifestations, if you will, of meaning similarity or semantic similarity and complexity. Now, these, as a data scientist, how would you look at this? You're essentially what we are doing is we are essentially taking the narrow topic of Laches under a microscope and are attempting to create a holistic approach at uncovering and examining primitive manifestations of basic logic within these legal texts. Currently, due to the technical nature of the technology used in most natural language processing and natural language understanding approaches, these are firmly rooted in the statistical analysis and thus the probabilistic likelihood of word and or token co-occurrence. This really depends on the actual approach you use. Most notably, these produce the data points of that are called word embeddings that allow us to quote unquote understand context and meaning. What is this? In our understanding of reality, languages that convey various manifestations of logic and meaning include such languages as mathematics, software code, and other abstract meaning representations for conveying connections and such meanings. Our prior research further indicates that in the realm of software development, object-oriented design, concepts such as encapsulation and inheritance actually do map neatly onto linguistic phenomena like polysemy and hyponymy. Going a bit further into the topic, object-oriented design is essentially, from a computer science point of view, is essentially an art of defining abstractions and their interactions with each other. From our perspective, it was born from a need to introduce structure to the way coders express their conceptual constructs, which is actually mimicking the way you could hypothesize that this mimics the way a human thinks logically. So our approach, more concretely, it loosely lends itself to a traditional textbook in hand way of learning a new language. Those of you who are bilingual, trilingual, will undoubtedly have gone through this process. When you're learning a language in a school class environment, usually you approach it by learning first the what's, then the how's, and then you progress onto constructing logical statements from those simple building blocks. As you can see from the pyramid, we are really using the data that we extract to build layers on top of each other. So we take the token co-occurrence, then we isolate the abstractions, we isolate the relations between them, and then we try and understand whether there is logic in there. So the result of this approach is that we have a lot of data that we can use to infer or estimate trends and hypothesize about their correlation to real world phenomena. Gerald, could I ask you to go on to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So this slide is more about the actual technical approach. How do we generate this data? So we are using off-the-shelf tools such as Spacey to generate the data for our analysis. In particular, we are using part-of-speech tags as a base layer to understand where are the nouns, where are the verbs, adjectives, to try and understand where do we have these semantic entities within our language and what denotes their relation to each other. We also use or rely heavily on universal dependency parsing, which for those of you who use natural language processing, who are in the field of natural language processing, will know that this essentially builds the connections between the different words or tokens inside a sentence. Lastly, we also use word embeddings at various levels of granularity, whether it's a word or an expression or a sentence. We mathematically aggregate them so that we are able to cross-check for any synonyms or any sort of texts that are roughly in the same context space. Penultimately, we use our own approach that has been developed in very close cooperation with Adam from a linguistic point of view to add metadata to these words and sentences and tokens through a bespoke post-processing pipeline that we put together from different concepts within linguistics. And lastly, we upload the data into a database, specifically a graph database, for its analysis due to its tree-like structure and the various levels of hierarchy that we extract from token data. And with that, I will pass on to our colleague Avalon, who will tell you a bit more about that.
Great, thank you, Dimitri. So yeah, and hello everyone from Edinburgh, Scotland. A very early morning here as well. So thus far, we have presented the landscape of our research, the interplay between law, linguistics, and how structural elements evolve over time, and how we can extract that data from legal text. So how can we weave together these ideas, incorporating the vast amounts of metadata available, so that we can delve into the historical developments of legal text, and more specifically Laches and Singaporean law? Well, as Dimitri sort of highlighted, mathematics and more specifically graph theory provide us with just the tools. At its most basic, a graph is made up of individual nodes connected to each other by edges. Nodes and edges can be labeled with all sorts of metadata and provide a framework on which to perform many types of graph analyses. As an example, consider a social network composed of individuals and their relationships. Individuals representing our nodes can have metadata such as name, age, and occupation, while edges can represent the relationships that individuals share, such as friend, colleague, and married. Of course, you can expand on that and run a whole load of analysis from Facebook to Google. Data science and graph theory is used all over the place. And so in our case, we are going to consider a portion of a phrase to sort of illustrate how we're graphically modeling our data. Next slide, please, Gerald. Thank you. Yeah, so in our case, and connecting to the dependency parse that Dimitri highlighted, we have several types of nodes, and these are connected by various dependencies. Those in red represent the words in the sentence. Those in blue represent our SVOs, which are chunks of data which handle the subject, verbs, and objects in our phrase. And in brown here, we have a noun chunk. In this case, well, normally a noun chunk is bundled with any descriptive words, but in this case, we just have the word it, which doesn't have any. Furthermore, additional metadata such as word embeddings are contained within some nodes, which will allow us to make those semantic comparisons. This framework forms a basis on which we can bundle important text together, analyze its significance, and explore further aspects of the legal text. For instance, I'd like to draw your attention to the two SVOs in blue. Here, one SVO is the object of the other. We call this a nested SVO, which denotes the existence of a nested clause. This is just one simple example of complexity in language, which will be tracked over time. Next slide, please, Gerald. To analyze the evolution of the semantic and syntactic structure surrounding Laches, we reconstruct methods through the following approaches. First, we look to isolate and group the language surrounding Laches while obtaining context from the surrounding text. We can query our database based largely on Adam's linguistic insights, finding the word Laches when in various positions in the syntactic hierarchy, and additionally looking for paths branching out from the word to obtain context. Another method of grouping information is through community detection algorithms, such as the Louvain algorithm, which allow us to segregate our graph into clusters based on graphical structure and optionally our metadata as well. And so using these groups and word embeddings, we can find similar language clusters in our database, allowing us to compare the similarity of the semantic and syntactic structure around Laches between texts of different time periods. When combined with other graph measures such as centrality, and also, or which can measure node or group influence, and also graphical complexity, which I touched on briefly, we hypothesize that the breadth of these measures will allow us to take a deep dive into the evolution of Laches in Singaporean law. With that, I will leave you with Megan for some final comments.
Our goals may appear somewhat ambitious, given that the concept of legal change has been studied extensively in legal academia for decades. However, we argue that the novelty of our approach lies in exploiting new computational linguistic methodologies to shed light on the subject. Perhaps we may even consider that stories of linguistic pasts may be telling of legal futures. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
Good. Yeah, Corinne.
Well, so I guess I have a question regarding the how you bring together your network model of the data, or how you plan to bring it together with the network methods that were briefly introduced. So the way that I understood, you actually have nodes and edges that mean different things, such that you would need to kind of adapt a lot of the algorithmic tools there to kind of account for the different information that you want to encode. So like, and do you have some preliminary ideas regarding the direction that that's going, or so how do you plan to adapt these tools and use them together to make sure that you actually capture what you're interested in tracing?
So I could take that question. Thank you. one of the powers of using a graph database versus a relational database, for instance, is the fact that you can add multiple layers on top of your data and intermingle them, intermix them in any way possible that you want. So this gives us a huge amount of flexibility. What we could build are, for instance, embedding clusters. What we could look at is grouping some of the either individual tokens or some SVOs by their topic or by the amount of connections incoming and outgoing that they have, by the type of connections incoming and outgoing that they have. So we have not built a specific hypothesis yet. We are working on putting together a concrete hypothesis for instance, for defining complexity within the scope of our research. As you can imagine, linguistics is a field that, or rather, the linguists will know the fact that linguistics is a field where there are many different hypotheses and concepts that compete somewhat for the same space, and we have this flexibility and ease of approach to take bits from each concept and combine them in a way that will allow us to isolate trends within the textual data. I hope that answers your question.
Well, so maybe if I may follow up, because I didn't mention graph databases, I just was talking about graph models, and you can store them in a variety of ways. So I infer that you're using a graph database. Like, what specific graph database are you using, and for what particular reasons, and why graph database and not just store like your edge list with annotations and your node list and then load that in?
That's a very simple answer. So we are using Neo4j, and specifically for its for the access to its data science libraries and plugins.
Thanks.
Daniel, quick question. How many cases do you expect in your entire frame of reference? Laches cases.
Right. Yeah. So let me answer this. So let me just check the folder size on my laptop right now. Then I can tell you.
I mean, I should presume you know the answer, because it should be no more than 100.
Oh yeah, it's if I'm not wrong, I want to give a precise answer, but my mind tells me 187, which is basically cases in which the word Laches appears in our database, which are for the international audience. It's this database called Lache. Yeah, it's the only official one that we have.
Excellent. I thought we need a frame of reference to know what kind of problem.
Right. Yeah. So the thing about Singapore is that we always throw out like 3-digit numbers, like 187 cases, and question is, well, do you have enough to do any statistical analysis? And of course, I think one thing that we tend to miss is that within these 187 cases, there are maybe, I think, an average of 6,000 words each, and maybe a few hundred sentences. So if you think about it from a sentence level, there's actually quite a lot of data points if we think about that as a unit of analysis. So at this point, we are not too worried about the broad sense of the scope power, but we'll see. Yeah.
Maybe a final technical question, because I'm intrigued by the use of Neo4j for this particular instance, and also by the reasoning given. So last time I checked Neo4j, it had basic boilerplate established network analysis algorithms, and you'd probably want to kind of hack your way into these plugins, or maybe make your own or so. So it hasn't become hackable in that sense. So how easy is it to kind of plug in your own algorithm if you want to customize something?
Thank you for the Sure. Thank you for the question. So the plugins within Neo4j, first of all, you can write your own algorithms in Java, in the language that it's its main language, basically. So yes, you can write custom algorithms, bespoke algorithms. So far, however, we've restricted ourselves to these vanilla algorithms that it has to do our initial analysis. And we found that though the ones that it already has within its tool set are sufficient to build at least the beginnings of our first hypotheses. Obviously, at a later stage, one thing we may need to do is create really properly bespoke and coded algorithms that will be optimized for performance, for instance.
One thing I would like to, one thing I'd like to add to that is that one method or one way you can use Neo4j is you can extract the adjacency matrices for, say a subset of your nodes. And you could run the graph algorithms in another software such as Python or MATLAB, for instance. So one thing, or one, I guess, workaround is through that. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.